Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those who are now joining. And I know we still have individuals in the process of joining this Caspian Policy Center and Near East South Asia Center seminar or workshop on Caspian security. Our topic today is developing roles of multilateral security organizations in the Caspian region, which is a pretty broad topic that we will have a chance to focus on for the next 90 minutes. My name is Roger Kangas. I'm the academic dean of the NISA Center, as well as a board member of the Caspian Policy Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, the individual who will be managing our discussion over the next 90 minutes, Professor Brianne Todd, a colleague of mine at the NISA Center, but also someone who is currently detailed at the Office of Secretary of Defense's Office on Central Asian engagement. So a lot of experience there and a lot of direct access to what's going on in the region. With that, Brianne, I will turn the microphone and camera over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kangas, and welcome to everyone joining us today. So for the past 30 years, we've witnessed the evolving roles of international security organizations in the Caspian region. After gaining independence, the countries of the South Caucasus and Central Asia quickly set out to build international relationships, protect their sovereignty, and safeguard their national security. All 8 countries joined the NATO Partnership for Peace program, and during the US and NATO mission in Afghanistan, countries on both sides of the Caspian Sea provided essential assistance to the United States and Europe. Yet over the last year, we've seen that the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization have been more active in the Caspian region. Following the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan, both the CSTO and SCO responded with military exercises in Central Asia. Since then, the SCO has promoted itself as a platform for intra-regional security cooperation in post-conflict settings, while the CSTO has emphasized its ability to provide military support to member states. This was demonstrated in January when CSTO forces, led by Russia, deployed to Kazakhstan, a member state. At that time, the mobilization of troops suggested the potential future use of multilateral security organizations as instruments for exerting political pressure, as well as avenues to maintain security ties. Today, we are joined by 4 distinguished academic experts who will provide their insights and analysis on the developing roles of international security organizations in the Caspian region. We have with us Iskander Alkubayev, who is the Director for Central Asia at the Oxford Policy Advisory Group. Previously, he served as the Executive Director of the Kazakhstan Council on International Relations. Iskander is currently pursuing a Master of Public Administration degree at Lee Kuan Yew University, where he is a Li Ka-shing Scholar. He has been published in the Astana Times, The Diplomat, and Foreign Policy. We also have with us Raffaello Pantucci, who is a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and a Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He has worked at influential strategic studies think tanks in London, Washington, and Shanghai, providing advice to governments, international organizations, and private companies. He is a regular contributor to the Financial Times, New York Times, and Foreign Policy, as well as the co-author of the upcoming volume, Sinostan, China's Inadvertent Empire, which will be released by Oxford University Press in July. We also have with us Fuhad Shabazz, who is a Baku-based policy analyst focusing on regional security, defense, and energy diplomacy issues in the South Caucasus, Turkey, and Iran. Previously, he was a visiting scholar at the Daniel Morgan School of National Security here in Washington. He has also served as a senior analyst at the Center for Strategic Communications in Baku, research fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies under the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, and research assistant at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Dr. Ayjan Sharshinova is a postdoctoral research fellow at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek. Prior to joining the OSCE Academy, she worked at UN and UNDP country offices in the Middle East and taught courses in international politics and academic writing. She holds a PhD in politics from the University of Leeds, and her research interests include public diplomacy, EU and Russian policies towards Central Asia, and international development. Today, we will begin with each of our panelists presenting opening remarks on our theme. Participants are welcome to submit their questions for panelists at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Following opening remarks, we will have what I know will be a robust discussion about international security organizations in the Caspian region. With that, I am now going to turn the microphone over to our first speaker, Iskander Akobayev. Iskander?
Thank you very much, Brienne, and it's a great pleasure to be among the distinguished guests from all over the world. And certainly the topic we're discussing today is very much related to the geopolitical context we are now into and experiencing. So first of all, when we mentioned about CSTO and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they are two very much important platforms with its own limits and opportunities. In this respect, if you look at the CSTO and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they have both commonalities. Specifically, they arise from the collapse of Soviet Union, and certainly one of the biggest objectives of those two platforms and two organizations was to kind of arrange and solve, first of all, the neighboring the issue of within the neighboring countries, specifically the delimitations of borders, and just to have a civil divorce in terms of the civilized divorce, specifically among themselves. So Shanghai Cooperation Organizations were limited in terms of the number. It were previously 5 member states, and then CSTO, previously called a CTO, also was directed specifically on that regard, just to solve or at least manage military political partnership between former Soviet Union countries. So in this respect, the evolution of Shanghai Cooperation Organization and CSTO, as we see it now, were quite gradual in its approach to and actions towards the geopolitical reality. And we didn't see kind of big statements and big transformation, drastic changes within this organization, except like some current countries leaving STO, some countries becoming observers, etc. So on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we see India and Pakistan becoming the newest members, and we see new observers. But as you rightly mentioned, Brian, maybe one of the most epic introduction of CSTO to the Central Asian region or Caspian region was the crisis in Kazakhstan, which happened in January of this year. And frankly speaking, on the local level, there was a big questions whether it's relevant to ask CSTO to come to specifically Russian-led troops to enter into the Kazakhstan. So taking into account the crisis and the political turmoil that we had in Kazakhstan, which involved the further arrests and investigations still going on the political coup d'etat, CSTO played more a political role rather than the military. And it's understood that CSTO is becoming much more kind of a security shield in the political terms for kind of regional elites, how to preserve the status quo in the region. So there was certainly the consequent question was whether Kazakhstan owes Russia in the future kind of relations. And those questions were asked during this latest St. Petersburg Economic Forum between President Putin and President Tokayev. After that, President Tokayev joined the Economic Forum in Qatar and publicly made its statement that was quite important in terms of diplomatic language that he used, because stemming from the kind of Kazakhstan's position that we do not recognize Lugansk and Donetsk, and that created some outcry in the media in Russia. President Tokayev certainly acknowledged the role of CSTO as a very important security mechanism and political mechanism in Central Asia for keeping things in order. But as we go further, it depends also on the external players like US, China, what kind of relations US and Russia will have in the future. And that also plays an important role what CSTO is going to act. So we're still very much into this self-reflection period of time, how CSTO is going to evolve and what does it mean for us or other countries who are member states. So in this respect, I think that the evolution of CSTO is still going on. And we can say that members of this organization still do not have the shared kind of common view on the security trends, because each country in this respect has its own position on the Ukraine issue as well. So in this respect, it's a little bit different from NATO. And even within the NATO, you see at least common understanding on Ukraine and common stance, but the position of Turkey specifically on the acceptance of Finland and Sweden is also very much different. Yeah. So as in CSTO might have different views on that. Coming to Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think it started really, it instilled very important message for international community that we would like to cooperate with China. And the Shanghai, so-called Shanghai spirit is still going on, but with acceptance of India and Pakistan, we certainly see that this platform is becoming much more on a political platform for political conflict resolution or like sideline meetings. So we shouldn't underestimate, but at the same time overestimate Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because for China, there are many other platforms like Belt and Road Initiative on the bilateral, multilateral level. China has launched its C5+1 platform similar to the US one. So China on the multilateral security mechanism is also willing to diversify its relations, not only sticking to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but promoting different channels of communication. But at least for now, or in the 19th or early 2000s, those platforms played an important role to solve more local, regional problems. But within this context and geopolitical global turbulence, we see that those platforms may rejuvenate the activities, and it's for other players and time to speak what we're going to see.
Thank you, Iskander. And we're going to turn now to Raffaello for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Brianne, and thank you to the Caspian Policy Center and NISA for the invitation to join you on this wonderful panel. So I'm going to focus my comments specifically on China and the SCO and leave the CSTO to others who are more knowledgeable on it than me, I am sure. I think I would build a bit on what Iskander just said, looking at the SCO. I think the SCO has always been a platform or an institution that has pretty much been whatever the individual member state wants it to be. Now, on the one hand, that means it is everything, but on the other hand, that means it's unable to really do anything. And I think that's a conscious choice in some ways. And it's a conscious choice, I think, by Beijing to create this institution in which it was able to sort of advance a vision of being very engaged with this region. But at the same time, it wasn't the only vehicle that China used. And I think that's often the key thing that we forget. People, and I think Russia in particular was guilty of this in the early years, saw the SCO essentially as the main vehicle through which China was going to engage with Central Asia. But what we saw, in fact, was that China was using this as just one of many different institutions and bilateral mechanisms to engage with the Central Asian countries, but also increasingly with a wide range of countries. Iskander pointed out the recent membership of India and Pakistan, but actually when we think about the Caspian, it's Iran's membership that in some ways is more significant. And in some ways, this is more significant because it really confirms this kind of vision in some ways of the SCO as being a grouping increasingly of powers that essentially see themselves as locked in some sort of a geopolitical struggle against the West. But at the same time as the organization increasingly going in this direction, at least in the sort of external articulation of what it's doing, for many of the reasons that I outlined before, and I think Iskander also pointed out, is never really able to articulate that vision entirely because not everyone entirely agrees with it. But at the same time, that doesn't really matter. From China's perspective, you have an institution here that has only grown since it was created. And while we talk a lot about the SCO as a security actor, and we point to the fact that, the institutions that it's actually physically built is the regional anti-terrorism structure in Tashkent, the Interior Ministry training legal studies body that's based at the Shanghai University of Politics and Law, the Secretariat in Beijing, and now they've added this Qingdao Development Center looking at sort of economic policy, and now there's talk of building in Dushanbe a drug center as well, a regional drug center. These institutions actually do very little in terms of actual hard security deliverables. When we do see sort of security training exercises being done under the SCO, they tend to be ones that, are kind of flagged as SCO when they don't necessarily involve all of the actors. What is interesting, I would argue, within this sort of context is some of the actors that we have seen get involved in some of these, and in particular India and Pakistan are worth looking at. They have, a very contentious and bilateral security relationship built a lot around concerns around terrorist organizations. And yet they engage jointly in counterterrorism exercises under the SCO. Now, what does engaging in these exercises mean? Often not a lot, really, it's just sort of showing up. But the mere fact of showing up and the attendance and the participation, I think, is very interesting. And I think what it does articulate is in some ways that a vision that China is offering a sort of structure to the region, which is very versatile. But at the same time as being very versatile, it doesn't really seem to advance any of the tangible goals that we would necessarily look at it and say, if you compare it to NATO, for example, it certainly doesn't do any of that. But it does provide an interesting format through which China is increasingly engaging with this wider, ever expanding range of actors across the Eurasian heartland. If we look at Iran, again, for example, after the decision for Iran to sort of formally be accepted as a member of the SCO, we saw the defense minister of China, Wei Fenghe, make a visit earlier this year to Tehran. During that session, he sort of affirmed what was a broad trend that we've seen, which is an increasing sort of bilateral security engagement between Iran and China. Now, what does this actually materially change? It's very difficult to tell. At the moment, it's not entirely clear much. There's clearly more security engagement happening between Iran and China. There's clearly more intelligence sharing potentially happening as well. There's a possibility of arms sales. There's a possibility of engagement. And there's increasing training exercises that we see being done between Iran, China, and Russia. And so we can see that all of these things are happening, but none of them are necessarily really happening within the SCO format. The SCO just becomes one of the many sort of strands in some ways of China's engagement with Iran, as much as it fits in the sort of wider engagement with the broader region. And I think this, in some ways, is the key point of the SCO and China's engagement across the board in this wider region, is that it's basically continued on the same trajectories that it has before. The conflict in Ukraine doesn't really seem to have changed much. What it does see, where China has tried to arguably take advantage or change things in a certain direction is more in the economic space, where we have seen some evidence of China trying to at least talk more loudly about some of the routes from China across Central Asia, across the Caspian, across the Caucasus, ultimately to Europe, highlighting how these are routes to Europe that sort of go around Russian sanctions. We've also seen that Chinese companies have not so much rushed in to fill, to take advantage of the opportunity they see in Russia. They're actually being very cautious. Huawei, the sort of much talked about Chinese technology company, has actually been pulling back from its investments in Russia, recently demonstrating a caution, recognizing that, it could really burn itself quite badly. Now, This is what's playing out in the short term. I think in the medium term, we'll actually start to see Chinese companies seeing some quite lucrative opportunities as Russian companies' value drops, but the assets they hold are still quite good, and China still remains relatively, lush with cash. So I think we'll see some advantage being taken there. But that is a sort of incidental from the conflict in Ukraine. But if we're looking at the sort of Central Asian Caspian region, what I would argue is that essentially what China's been doing is essentially a continuation of what it was doing before. The C5+1 that met earlier this year met its third time. This is the third time that format has engaged in. It's quite clearly a format that is sort of parroting the United States C5+1. But this is not the only thing. We've also seen the Chinese push out the Tunxi initiative to try to bring sort of regional engagement towards Afghanistan. And we've also seen them continue to try to replicate some of the multilateral formats that they used to run between Afghanistan and Pakistan with the new Taliban government in power, including restarting, I think it was initially a deputy director, Ministry of Foreign Affairs level engagement between the three countries, which I think now has been elevated to the sort of ministers of foreign affairs. So this is a structure that existed under the old regime in Kabul and has now been sort of continued on. So in many ways, what we've seen China do on the security side is essentially continue what it was doing before, which is continuing to slowly increase its security presence and its security engagements across this wider region. But where I think we have to maybe draw a bit of a line and be very careful is that what I don't think we see China doing is rushing in to fill some sort of security vacuum or try to displace the United States or displace Russia. What we see China doing is focusing quite narrowly on its specific security concerns. When we see sort of PLA diplomacy like travels of Wei Fenghe, this is quite demonstrative in many ways. This is China showing, we are engaging with these people through the PLA as well. We are engaging with these powers. In practical terms, what we see China actually doing is really quite narrow security things that are very much focused on its interests. So we can see in Pakistan, for example, there's a push to try to protect their nationals and their assets because they found that the Pakistanis seem continually unable to actually do this. In Afghanistan, there's caution being pushed out by the government and talk of trying to maybe get security companies in there to try to protect some of their assets. In Central Asia, we can see that there is an increase in security activity, but it's really quite narrowly focused on Tajikistan. And it's really quite narrowly focused on where it sees a gap in the sort of security umbrella there, which might potentially threaten it. This is not the kind of Russian view of its role in Central Asian security, which is this kind of paternalistic view saying, we are the sort of fathers of this region and we will look after these unfortunate little countries. This is a much more narrow engagement. I think that is where we do see China doing. And I think what's changed is that in the absence of the United States and in the growing instability that we have seen, unfortunately, in Central Asia and South Asia since the fall of Kabul, we see that China's sort of efforts are becoming more prominent, because in some ways, everyone else are sliding away. So I think what we're really not seeing is a transformation or a change of China pushing into fill a vacuum, but rather a continuation of what was going on before, but rather it's seeming more prominent now that we are seeing this sort of general retrenchment and pullback by others. And I'll stop there, conscious that I think I've come up to my time, and I will hand it back to Brianne to take us to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Raffaello. And we'll go now to Fuad for his remarks.
Thank you, Brianne. My special thanks to all organizers who just put all the distinguished speakers together today. So what my colleagues have already mentioned about Central Asian part and CSCO as an organization. So my focus will be entirely on Caucasus region, because we still witnessing the rising challenge of the South Caucasus country face, security dilemma they faced in the light of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, the intervention that happened on February of this year. So, and all these small regional states, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, found themselves facing a strictly security dilemma and they faced the necessity of delicate balancing between Russia and the West, since given the fact that all those three states clearly pursue different foreign policy agendas, with one pursuing a strictly pro-Atlantic policy, with another posting a Russian military base on its soil, and another one clearly delicately maneuvering between the West and Russia and avoiding to fall under the influence of any organization or any other international actor or regional actor and trying to save its face or its independently develop a foreign policy agenda in the face of security dilemmas. So, but clearly Russia's war against Ukraine has put the Caspian countries in a quandary, in part because each in its own way is seeking to maintain their fragile independence through a balance in the relationship with Russia. And not only Russia, but also non-traditional regional players like China, the European Union, NATO, and the United States. So, but each in its own way is now appealed by the war in Ukraine, while Moscow continues to push in order to get those countries support, because having support of those countries and all post-Soviet states, including Central Asian countries, could give more credibility to Russia and give like legitimacy to its military intervention in Ukraine. So, however, this country is seeking to take maneuvering delicately because they are pretty much sure that supporting Russia's current military campaign in Ukraine could create a dangerous precedent for future. So, therefore, we should not surprise that each those of countries in its own way is seeking to take steps to move closer toward the West in ways that would not automatically trigger Russian retribution. So this means that they individually holding discussions or consultations with NATO, to some extent with the European Union or with the United States, because recently we have witnessed that there's a very busy diplomatic traffic in the South Caucasus country with United States deputy undersecretaries traveling to those three countries, holding consultations and negotiations, which clearly a sign of that Russia is now facing challenges because those countries can diversify away from its traditional sphere of influence in the coming future. So this is also because the Caspian states seem to be put under more pressure, as for them it could be a dangerous gambling game, either supporting Russia or making a harsh rhetoric against Russia and its the current foreign policy agenda. So obviously Russia is still the major regional power, and its ability to disrupt the common use of Caspian resources is a key reason why some Caspian states are reluctant to challenge the Kremlin's narrative on Ukraine. So for others, the events in Ukraine act as a cold shower as Russia can replicate the tragic experience in Ukraine in the Caspian region. But if they decide to misconstruing the policies of Caspian Sea states toward the respective Russian minorities as discriminatory. So although those countries do not have significant Russian minority like as Ukraine does, but still they do not want really to create a precedent. So in the Caspian region, there's only one Caspian state which sided by Russia is Iran, because the Iranian leadership has absorbed the bottom line of the Kremlin's narrative describing this situation and what happened in Ukraine as strictly rooted in NATO's provocations towards against Russia. So on the other side, Russian position, weakened position due to its war in Ukraine could lead the Kremlin to push those countries to. I mean, the important fact that need to be considered in the case of South Caucasus is that those countries, those region itself is plagued with long-term conflicts. In Georgia, we have Abkhazian and Ossetian conflict, and you have Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and you have Russia acting as a mediator, as a peace mediator, as they call themselves, peace mediator to regulate these countries and get them on board, or to keep them in its closer side or its own sphere of influence. So in this case now, Russia trying, as we know, trying to regulate and mediate this conflict or peace negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, believing that this will add more value to the partnership, the bilateral partnership, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, and also could create pave the way for future peace negotiations that could be possibly held between Georgian, Abkhazian, certain separatist regimes, which is supposed to save Russia's face, as some European media outlets describe it. So no one can predict, of course, what could happen in the near future about how those countries will shift or make some changes to its foreign policy agendas toward Russia or toward other organizations. And given the specific of this region, because the Caucasus region is a landlocked region, which, unlike Central Asian region, which holds close relations with Russia and China at the same time, due to geographical proximity, Caucasus region cannot really count on organizations like NATO or other non-regional actors to actively engage with this region, because this region is clearly considered as a geopolitical backyard by Russia. So, and when war just started, broke up in Ukraine, we have witnessed how Vladimir Putin's narrative changed toward all former Soviet republics, because he declared them to be Russia's special sphere of influence, and escalating his wording and has called them exclusive sphere of influence. So therefore, we should not surprise also that shortly there will be a new president, because regional states like Azerbaijan and Georgia, as I said, Georgia cannot openly resist, as they laid out by the governmental media and governmental officials itself, because they cannot trigger Russia, given its the current conflict situation. So there's only Azerbaijan, which dispatched around 6 million humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, calling them as a necessity and providing free fuel for ambulances and all the emergency vehicles in Ukraine, and which followed by Georgia commissioned a large shipment of humanitarian assistance for the Ukraine people. Some Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan make humanitarian assistance too. And this all happened because those countries decided to stay on the right side. The right side here means side by the West, even not openly, just to protect or to preserve their own crucial interests. So, as I mentioned earlier, this war has shifted Russian military focus away from the Caucasus, because they're traditionalists, such a way it acted traditionally as a security guarantee for regional conflicts and for those separatist regimes like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And its diminished ability to project power will affect other conflicts of the South Caucasus as well in the near future. So where Russia serves as a patron and protector for this separatist region with internationally recognized borders of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and therefore it serves as a primary security partner for those self-proclaimed republics in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and a clear signal that both in case of Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia, Russia will not tolerate any active interference of intervention of NATO or the European Union or the United States to this region, because they did a mistake in Ukraine side, and Russia will not clearly repeat that mistake in the case of South Caucasus. So However, we see that Russia's military campaign in Ukraine has not gone to plan. Moscow loss on the battlefield prompted it to redeploy Russian forces from the breakaway regions. And just to conclude for now, one should clearly define that the current state of geopolitical situation in South Caucasus and in Central Asia. We may expect more assertive policy pursued by NATO or the European Union or the United States, being backed by the United States in this region, with the aim to get away those regions away from Russia as much as it's possible, or at least to introduce new new regional policy dimension to make sure that those countries are not fall under strict influence of Russia in the near future. So thank you very much. This is for now.
Thank you so much, Fuad. And we'll go now to Ayjan for her remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian, and thanks to the colleagues for their input contributions. So I will try to focus on the Central Asian side of things. So thanks, Fuad, for taking care of the side of Caucasus. In terms of the international security organizations and the region, I believe that with the Russian-born Ukraine, Central Asian states are doing their best to continue staying as neutral as possible given the circumstances, because any other course of action might result in strong repercussions, either from the Russian side or from the collective West side. However, this is a very tricky situation, obviously, for all Central Asian states, because on one hand, the majority of them are members of the regional security organizations, and some of them even have used some of the regional organizations to pursue their own goals, like Kazakhstan earlier this year. At the same time, it's quite difficult to support the Russian course of action, given the situation in Ukraine and the fact that if you have seen Putin's speech back in February, you could have, or he could have replaced Ukraine with any other post-Soviet country, and it would be illegitimate in his eyes reason to invade any of former Soviet states. Nowadays, all Central Asian countries are following the actions or inaction of security organizations, both regional and international, because this is a sign how they would react if anything like this happens to any of us. However, there are a lot of mixed messages. On one hand, NATO and the European Union show some support to Ukraine, but the support is not always decisive. It does not always provide with the solutions or considerable solutions to the crisis in Ukraine. And at the same time, Russia is quite assertive and is getting more and more difficult for Central Asian republics to oppose Russia or to express any sort of discontent with the Russian course of action. Speaking of the Csto and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I would agree with Rafael on this regard. Both organizations has long turned into quite original instruments or tools whose main purpose is to simply exist and to harness the power of authoritarian League of Gentlemen in the times of crisis. The charter of Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Csto are used whenever the leaders in the region want to use them. They do not necessarily pursue the security of the countries. They often pursue the security of the regimes rather than the countries themselves. In this regard, the very existence of these organizations is power, presence is power, and the narratives that they pursue and create are quite assertive as well in a way. But I think the main message of both organizations and the main similarity between both organizations, Csto and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is that they guard the interests of the authoritarian regimes of its members. And even the fact that the Csto, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, has invoked its Article 4, the action in terms of collective security, only January this year, after so many years of existence and after so many appeals, actually direct appeals to use the Csto forces, It only happened this year by the request of President Tokayev of Kazakhstan, and only in the face of quite powerful protest action in Kazakhstan. Now, given the circumstances and specifically the war in Ukraine, the situation remains very precarious for Central Asian countries because we still depend on Russia a lot, both economically and in terms of security arrangements. But Russia depends on us too now, given the international isolation that it's facing at the moment following the war in Ukraine. And you can see that Putin is traveling to Central Asia as we speak. And it's quite interesting that his first choice to visit, or first country to visit, is Tajikistan, because it seems that Tajikistan would probably be the biggest ally in the region for Russia. Because as you might have heard, Tokayev has declared his reluctance to acknowledge the so-called sovereign republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And generally, Kazakhstan is taking a more assertive foreign policy line. The balancing is difficult still, but it is trying to raise a voice, and possibly because of the security concerns of its own. And afterwards, Putin is traveling to Turkmenistan. So tomorrow is going to be the start of the Caspian summit, and that would be very interesting to follow, because this trip of Putin's is the first foreign visit since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So the choice of countries is quite curious. As I said, it's Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. What they will discuss would be very interesting too. What would be the outcome of these negotiations or discussions would be interesting as well. And even though the Caspian summit is supposed to focus on the legal status of the Caspian Sea and the use of Caspian onshore, offshore resources, everything is political right now. So I believe the next couple of days would be quite interesting in terms of, well, for Central Asia observers, for Caucasus observers, but also for general international politics observers. So overall, Central Asian republics are trying to keep a neutral standing, at least officially, informal speaking, but it is getting increasingly difficult given the length of the war in Ukraine, given the intensity of the war in Ukraine, and given some of the statements of politicians in Russia, which affect directly the security of such countries as Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayjan, for your remarks. And we will now begin the discussion part of today's panel. As was previously announced and in the chat, please go ahead and submit your questions down in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We already have lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and start pulling from the ones that we have received and posing them to our panelists. We have a couple of questions about the CSTO and its role in Kazakhstan in January. So I'll combine these two questions and pose them to Iskander and Ayjan. The first question is, will the application of the CSTO intervention in January in Kazakhstan make countries more reluctant to request assistance with rhetoric in Russia suggesting that President Tokayev is somehow indebted to Russia? The second question was, the CSTO has had mixed application in the first half of 2022, with Kazakhstan's successful invocation of Article 4 in January, but Russia's less successful request for help in the war against Ukraine since February. What do these two opposing responses mean for the future of the CSTO? So we'll go first to Iskander and then to Ayjan for their responses.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's very important questions for Kazakh society and Kazakhstan's foreign policy in general sense. And we need to look at the CSTO countries as like separate countries. And Kazakhstan, due to its, as Ayjan mentioned, due to its own security concerns, had its own response, specifically calling CSTO troops, not only just Russian troops on the paper, to support Kazakhstan in its difficult times. But each country has its own context within the CSTO platform, and the rhetoric and the approaches can be different as well. So we cannot expect the similar or identical statement from the CSTO countries towards Russian activities in Ukraine. Certainly, the Article 4, which was implied, I think this is going to be a matter of discussion in the future, and the debts to Russia will be on the kind of mass media rhetoric, and we see that information back on the media level there is a backlash between Kazakh and Russian media platforms, but it's I think at some point it's normal process as we didn't get before, because even within the NATO we see sometimes like countries disagree on many fronts, whether it's NATO membership, etc. So CSTO countries may have different approaches. As, for example, Ayjan mentioned that Putin is traveling to Tajikistan, and at some point, Tajikistan has military base there, and certainly the Afghanistan issue is will be one of the priorities to discuss, since Tajikistan has very different stance on the supporting Taliban or like supporting the Northern Alliance, etc. So it has a very much different stand from all other Central Asian republics in this respect towards Afghanistan issue, and Tajikistan is very much important. And I think the CSTO is still in this process of evolution, specifically on the rhetoric side. And I think it's more about tactics than strategy here, where certainly the space for geopolitical maneuvering for CSTO members is becoming narrower. And with this geopolitical rivalry, which is rising up, we need to take a specific stance. And as I mentioned before during the conference in DC, that even stance of neutrality is a stance for Central Asian countries, because taking into account the economic interrelation and geography within itself, it's important that Central Asian countries can at some point have a voice on the matters which is happening now in Ukraine. And this is a very sensitive time, and I hope that Central Asian republics can kind of pass this through its by own means.
Thank you, Iskander. Ayjan, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Yep, thank you very much. So Kazakhstan's successful invocation of Article 4 in the early January, I think that was, I'm 90% sure that Tokayev inquired indirectly or through sort of background channels before actually declaring the support or requesting the official support, knowing that the support will be provided. Russia has not done that. So officially there has not been a request for help officially from the Russian official sort of sources. There was a conversation in the Russian parliament at the beginning of June saying that it would be great if we could get the help of the CSTO forces in terms of peacekeeping operations, so on and so forth. And the response was dead silence from the side of the other CSTO members. So about a week ago, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson of Kremlin, said that they're not even considering the help of the CSTO because CSTO has proved itself useful and efficient in other operations. So he produced a whole bunch of things to say that CSTO is relevant, but we don't need the help of CSTO at the moment in Ukraine. So officially, Russia has not requested any help. Unofficially, this is actually a curious aspect that is often ignored because we think that Russia is the big power within the organization, and we take it for granted that Russia does what Russia does without asking anybody else and informing them. But if you look at the organization, it's a collective security organization. So ideally, when one of the members of a collective security organization is planning to engage in a full-fledged military operation in the territory of a non-member state, it should probably inform other members of the security organization, which was not the case. I'm afraid this came as a surprise to both CSTO members and Shanghai Cooperation Organization members. Again, I might be wrong, but that's my feeling and that's my impression. To what extent that has been appreciated by other members of CSTO and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, again, I don't know, but I can imagine they were quite upset with Russia's unilateral move. In terms of reluctance, I believe so. I think that's a very reasonable feeling to have and a very sensible emotion also to have, that there was a conversation that Tokayev now owes Putin, but surprisingly enough, Tokayev has been quite bold in his official statements, bold and not bold, because even when he declared that he does not acknowledge the sovereignty of Luhansk and Donetsk, he listed a whole bunch of other territories. And those territories have to do with some other countries. So in a way, I think he was trying to soften the blow. So even though Tokayev is trying to pronounce his position or Kazakhstan's position in this conflict, I think he's still quite terrified with the potential repercussions of what he's doing. So I believe so. I think, yeah, it's a very legitimate question to ask to what extent other member states would be willing to ask for the CSTO help in future. I think they will actually have to weigh quite hard or do a proper cost-benefit analysis to see whether it's worth it, whether it's worth getting the involvement of CSTO forces in exchange for an implied agreement to participate in any future military campaigns of one of the members.
Thank you so much. Raffaello, we have a couple of questions about China and the SCO that I'm going to pose to you. So the first question is, because the SCO is so versatile and covers so many different facets of engagement, do you think that it is eventually going to lead to its downfall? The fact that it has so many countries, I think now it is the regional security organization with the most countries and also covers the most area geographically. But also as a result of that, has it become less of a security organization and gone more into other areas, specifically political and economic? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I think it's an interesting question about this here. I mean, look, I think go back and look at the beginning of the SCO, right? We tend to think about it now, we remember it now, but if you go back and look at its early days, when the SCO was first created back in 2001, the Chinese were actually pushing an economic narrative. They saw this as an economic actor, and they saw this as an entity with which they wanted to use kind of umbrella to engage this region economically. That was their kind of driving force. The idea, the first sort of thing that we saw happen from the SCO was the creation of the RATS, the Regional Anti-Terrorism Structure. And so everyone immediately latched on to counterterrorism as the kind of driving force for this entity. But from my perspective, it's always really been more a kind of banner issue that everyone can get around. You know, these are 6 countries that could all basically agree what a terrorist looks like, and then none of them liked it. And so this was kind of a useful thing that they could all agree on. And so counterterrorism becomes kind of the key thing that they all can agree and becomes a kind of banner they all gather around. They don't actually do much counterterrorism activity together. And actually, if you look at it, all the different member states did push different sort of narratives. So, you know, if we look at Moscow in the early years referred to it quite derisively as the sort of that counterterrorism structure. And actually, in the early days of when it was still the Shanghai Five, you know, the Chinese had to push quite hard to get the Russians to even show up. You know, when, you know, there just quite wasn't the interest. The Uzbeks grudgingly decided to join in 2001 because at that point, Karimov seemed to be more in a mood to kind of engage with his region and was a bit worried about other issues and thought he needed to be part of the structure that was emerging. But, you know, the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks, I think, essentially saw it as a regional structure that they could join, which might give them access to, you know, some wealthy neighbors. And this was a good thing. And they needed the support. And the Kazakhs just sort of wanted to be involved in something that was happening in their region. So, you know, this was never really intended to be a kind of security structure. And if you go look forwards, you know, they push forwards on all these different angles, but fundamentally, you know, the Chinese have continued to try to push economic ideas through the SCO. They've talked about creating an SCO free trade area. They've talked about creating a joint account. They've talked about creating a development bank sort of together within this structure. And now they've pushed these ideas of these economic development zones, which are all basically essentially structures for Chinese companies to operate throughout this region. Alibaba has done a lot through kind of SCO structures as well. But this is all, so it's really kind of an economic push that if you look at where the force really is, that's where it sits. The security stuff, in some ways, is the stuff that they can all kind of talk about a bit more easily. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of these countries are really quite worried about overdominance of China economically in their space. And so in some ways, they're not willing to engage. And the reason we haven't seen an FTA take off, the reason we haven't seen the development bank idea take off is frankly because the others didn't want it to go forward. Now, some of them did. It's very funny to see that, you know, the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks quite regularly refer to the fact that they'd love to host a new development bank, you know, because they would like access to those funds and resources. But all the other members are a bit more hesitant. And so that sort of blocks it. So I think that's why I think, you know, in reality, it's you know, each member state pushes in a different direction. But if you're going to talk about the Chinese, they really push. The economic one is the one that they're sort of most actively engaged on. And then they frankly take advantage of the opportunities the SCO gives them to engage with all these partners on other issues. And not the security ones that people really worry about get dealt with at a bilateral level. To then go to this really interesting question about versatility leading to destruction. I think it's a very nice way of putting it, frankly. But I think it, you know, and it reminded me of a time when I was in China talking to some Chinese experts about the SCO, and this is when the India-Pakistan membership was sort of being discussed. And, you know, at the time, everyone assumed that this was basically the Russians who were pushing India. And then if India was going to join, well, then Pakistan had to join because the Chinese wouldn't let one go without the other. But it was really the Russians who were pushing the Indians through. And the story I got from Chinese experts was they thought that this was, you know, and here I'll flag up the fact that I'm a Brit, that this was essentially the Russians trying to do to the SCO what the Brits were trying to do to the European Union, which is basically push the idea of expansion to reduce the ability of the organization to actually operate. Now, you know, I think that is possibly what Moscow is trying to achieve through these goals. But at the same time, it misses the point of the SCO in a way, which is that it is kind of an empty shell in many ways that does all of these things, but at the same time doesn't own anything and really move anything tangibly forwards itself. And I think that's the key. And as long as it can maintain that kind of structure, that looseness, that means it will basically be able to continue to expand forever, because you know, you can just move the goalposts in a way. If you're not really committed to, you know, if everyone can say no to anything, and frankly, no one sees it as the key structure that they're going to achieve any goals through, that means it doesn't really matter. You can continue to let people join, you continue to expand, you continue to sort of pull things in and do different stuff, because at the end of the day, everyone's just kind of using it as an afterthought, and engages with it because it's kind of nice to demonstrate, you know, politically, and everyone wants to be friendly to the Chinese because they want their economic investment, but they only want it up to a point, you know, so it kind of becomes that kind of a shell rather than that. And as long as that's kind of what everyone seems happy to advance, I think, no, you can continue to expand, because in some ways it doesn't really matter. And ultimately what you'll find is that countries, in China in particular, will achieve the goals that they really want to get done at a bilateral level, or at a minilateral level, rather than through the SCO. The final point I'd say on this, because I'm going on a bit, is on the security side, you know, a really good indicator of how little China saw the SCO as a useful structure to engage on security questions was the 2016 creation of the Quadrilateral Cooperation Coordination Mechanism between Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and China, which essentially brought together the chiefs of defense staff of those countries to talk about, you know, border issues and essentially the Wuhan corridor and security questions that emanate from there. You know, why wasn't that done through the SCO? You know, all of those countries are members or observers of the SCO, and the Chinese have tried push very hard for Afghanistan to become more engaged with the SCO, and yet they couldn't. And so they had to create this other minilateral structure to achieve these particular security goals, which are obviously of great concern to China. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Raffaello. Fuad, I have a question for you about NATO. In your remarks, you framed your comments in terms of the security dilemmas of small states and noted that it's not likely that countries in the South Caucasus can really depend on NATO because it is not a regional organization. It's geographically outside of the sphere of influence that, you know, a country like Russia might have on the Caucasus. So, a question for you: what role should the NATO Partnership for Peace program play now that many in the region view the withdrawal from Afghanistan as the United States and its allies leaving the region? What should NATO engagement look like going forward? Any thoughts on that would be appreciated.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier in the speech, that Caucasus is a landlocked country, and it's specifically important for Russia, because Russia has long been trying to put Georgia and Azerbaijan into the Csto as well, because that will ensure its unique monopoly over those countries and give them more security leverage to keep those countries in its sphere of influence. But Azerbaijan, given its resources and given the geopolitical situation that emerged following the post-Karabakh war, and Azerbaijan emerged as a small power state in this highly volatile region. we cannot expect NATO or any other Western military alliance, military organization to be directly engaged with this region, because that looks pretty much impossible. So Azerbaijan and Georgia develop a unique cooperation format, security cooperation format with NATO member Turkey. So in this regard, Turkey seems to be that country which has the second biggest army in NATO, with high combat capabilities and technical capabilities. Turkey provides military assistance, military build-up both to Azerbaijan and Georgia, because we know that there's annual joint military drills of Georgian, Azerbaijan, and Turkish special forces, which will be conducted this year in October. And this partnership format, in military security partnership format, has been set for in the last several years, which created a kind of new bond between those countries, which Russia cannot resist. So, of course, NATO can provide more support through PFP. More intensive training of military personnel, more technical assistance, and more more financial assistance for military of those countries to develop their military build-up more, or get its in a more speed way. That will be in the sense of tackling Russian influence, will be very useful, because otherwise we see that how Russia having great losses on the battleground in Ukraine, now tries to push those countries at least them to integrate more into its own sphere of influence. And with Azerbaijan signing those document on allied cooperation with Russia, but the fact is that Azerbaijan has already signed a military alignment with Turkey, which is the document by the Shusha Declaration, 2021 last year, which guarantees that there will be a Turkish military support should the third party intervene in Azerbaijan, or vice versa. So therefore we see that the United States and NATO itself support Turkish ambitions, or Turkish willingness to cooperate with those countries, because Turkey is the most safe route, or most safe channel that NATO can integrate those countries into its own security network. So therefore, in the future, I would not guarantee that the NATO's involvement in this region will be more visible, but I predict that Turkish rising role in the security and military field of these countries will be more equal and will be more explicit. So this is so we should bear in mind that this will be only serve the interests of NATO and North Atlantic Treaty community.
Thank you, Fuad. We have a couple of questions on China and its relationship with the Taliban. So I will pose this to Raphael and Iskander to get your views on this. First, will China's expansion of relations with the Taliban create a stronger security presence in the Caspian region? How will this relationship affect threats from the Taliban on the region? Any thoughts on those questions? Raphael, we'll go to you first.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, if I could very, very briefly, forgive me, Brian, I think on the last question about NATO, I think one of the mistakes, frankly, that NATO made over the past few years was shutting down its liaison office in Tashkent. It was a very small operation. It was, I'm sure, a low-cost thing, but moving that to Georgia, I mean, I think NATO frankly shot itself in the foot. You had an institution there that had been built up over a long period of time, was very, very effective in demonstrating a seriousness, a presence in the region, and they decided to pull back. So I think NATO trying to come back into Central Asia is always going to be very complicated, not only in the wake of the, American withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also frankly because of things like that, which just showed a sort of level of unseriousness, I'm afraid to say, towards this particular region. So forgive me for that brief interlude. But to get back to your question about Afghanistan and the Taliban, I mean, look, I think that the Chinese, what's fascinating to me about the Chinese engagement with the Taliban is the degree to which in some ways it's kind of an extension of what they were doing before. Essentially, what they've done is leaned in heavily to engage with the Taliban government because they're worried about it completely collapsing in on itself. And they recognize that they're one of the few who are actually still there and still present. And, no matter what happens in Afghanistan, at the end of the day, they're still going to share a border with this country. But they've got all sorts of problems and all sorts of concerns there that in many ways echo the concerns and problems that they had under the Republic government. In fact, one could argue that under the Republic government, they had potentially a better situation in many ways. The Taliban have not really demonstrated an interest in going after the groups that the Chinese are most concerned about. The fact that we saw the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party leader, Abdul Haq, put out a video just recently showing he was celebrating Eid in Afghanistan, gives you a sense that the Taliban don't seem to be curtailing Abdul Haq's movements, which is, a key kind of request the Chinese keep banging on about, that they want, the Taliban to do something about Uyghur militants gathering in Afghanistan. This was an issue that they had previously, but previously the Republic government was actually going after these people because for the Republic government, they saw ETIM or TIP, depending on which acronym you want to use, essentially Uyghur militants, as people who are fighting against them alongside the Taliban. So they were quite happy to go after them and would go after them and quite happily hand them over to the Chinese afterwards. The Taliban government haven't really demonstrated that. So, the alliance and the push that we're seeing from the Chinese side is very much focused on sort of economics at the moment. But again, it's economics up to a point. They've opened up the possibility for Chinese traders to go to Afghanistan and try to exploit some of the sort of mineral opportunities that exist. But the state-owned enterprises, CNPC and MCC, which are engaging kind of the big projects, which could really be kind of game changers to Afghanistan, they're still talking in pretty much the same terms that they were when the Republic government was in power. They're complaining about the same things. They're worrying about the same issues. And let's not forget, these are really quite difficult projects in parts of the countries that there is zero infrastructure in. So you've got to build a lot before you're going to be able to actually get to these resources. And the companies, frankly, can see that this is not necessarily an incredibly stable situation. And so they're a bit hesitant to sort of jump in. So I would question the degree to which actually the Chinese are sort of, are playing a really strong security role in a way that's going to bolster and stabilize the situation in Afghanistan. I think they're still sort of hedging. But what's different is that everything else has changed. So the United States is no longer present. The Taliban government's now in power. And so that means from the Chinese perspective, you have to lean in heavily to make sure your interests can still somewhat be served as best as you can. And I think that's what changed. Previously, they could kind of rely on the United States or rely on others to essentially provide some sort of a cushion or security guarantee. That doesn't necessarily exist. And that's why you see them leaning in, because the Taliban want to be seen to have international partners. And the Chinese recognize that through diplomatic engagement, through opening some limited economic valves, they can be seen to be actually doing that. And that's something that will sort of help strengthen and stabilize the Taliban government, ultimately is what the Taliban government wants. So I think that's why we're seeing that. So in terms of will it create, greater stability or security in the Caspian, I'm not sure it's really going to change anything, to be honest with you. It might help the Taliban government make it look like it's a bit more stable, but ultimately the Chinese are not the ones who are going to go hunting after ISKP, and the Chinese aren't really the ones who are going to go hunting after Baluchi or TTP or other groups that are using Afghanistan as a base to kind of destabilize the neighboring region. So, they will lean on the Taliban to do something about it. They will use whatever levers they have, but they don't really know how to do that. They haven't haven't really done it successfully in other environments. If it comes to their narrow security concerns, they will find ways of applying much stronger pressure, and they'll get very angry about that. But in terms of the wider security context, I think they're happy to sort of hedge, continue to build relations, maintain contacts, but essentially see how things play out, rather than actually strengthening and stabilizing the situation. I'll stop there.
Yes, I fully agree with Raffaello, specifically on the narrow strategic interest of China in Afghanistan. China is very pragmatic in its cooperation with everybody, actually. So when it comes to Afghanistan, with very kind of weak infrastructure, China will, and still uncertainties within the security realm, I think it's going to be a kind of China will think twice, just moving forward and just doing the wide job that NATO forces and US has been doing for many years before. So in this respect, I think China is just a pragmatic player, focusing on its border and its economic interest, and maintaining the contacts they have already preserved. And if you take into account that before the fall of Kabul, one of the senior members of Taliban visited Beijing, and they reaffirmed kind of talks with the Chinese government. And so after that, we see the fall of Kabul, the withdrawal of US troops and NATO troops from Afghanistan very fast. So it's for China, it's like pragmatic in business matters, certainly involving some kind of big area of security, but security for themselves rather than for Afghanistan in this respect.
Thank you, Iskander and Raffaello. Aijan, we'll go to you now. In your remarks, you talked about how the Central Asian countries are currently trying to maintain a sense of neutrality during this conflict in Ukraine. We have a couple of questions here, and the first one is, what does multi-vector diplomacy mean to the Central Asian states, not just in the aftermath of Ukraine, but also the withdrawal from Afghanistan? In practical terms, how can these states demonstrate neutrality vis-a-vis external powers? Would this be through the formation of a regional Central Asian body? Is that an option?
Great, thanks for the question. To be fair, the multi-vector foreign policy has always been problematic, but quite a few Central Asian states insisted on pursuing the so-called multi-vector foreign policy. In practical terms, it's basically none of our presidents say anything offensive that could cause any repercussions with any international actors or regional powers. And it does work, but I don't think that the international actors are stupid in a way not to see through the sneakiness of the multi-vector foreign policy rhetoric. So it's quite difficult to maintain that, as I mentioned. And for example, the president of Kyrgyzstan, I think he spoke quite early. So I think about 2 days after the invasion of Russia, he posted something on Facebook where he said, maybe Ukraine has caused that. Maybe Russia had to do that. So obviously, maybe was a note to the multi-vector policy, but maybe does not cancel the rest of the narrative. And it doesn't always translate very well in practical terms. One of the better examples is probably our Minister of Foreign Affairs when he had a press conference with Lavrov. He sat right next to Lavrov and they answered all the questions. But if you listen to what he says, he manages to build his narrative in a way that it's neither yes nor no. So it's very skillful diplomatic action, but he has been dismissed now. So it doesn't work in practical terms very often, but the alternatives are too dangerous to pursue because Central Asian states, they are still not too powerful to oppose actively the Russian policy or to oppose actively the US policy in the region. So they have to find ways to reconcile all the policies in the region and not to offend anybody. In terms of Central Asian Union, that would be great. That's like an ideal thing for us to go forward. But unfortunately, historically, we have always been integrated or disintegrated or had any sort of relations via somebody. And I think that has created a certain path dependency. So we still tend to communicate as C5 plus whoever, as a part of a regional organization, as a part of a Caspian organization. So we always have external actors sort of in our relationships that affect those relationships immensely. Ideally, yes, it would be great if we could set aside the differences and communicate directly. But I believe maybe external powers see this as a threat as well, and therefore they try to lead the integration. The EU comes with regional integration projects. Russia comes with regional integration projects. The US tries to suggest something, maybe less nowadays, but it did so beforehand. Turkey is trying to build a pan-Turkic narrative as well. So there are actors that are trying to unite us, but unless it comes from us directly and there is a political will from all the 5 countries, I think it's going to be quite challenging to build a Central Asian integration project, a successful one.
I want to follow up on that thought just briefly, because you mentioned the whole C5+1 format. And as you noted, so many countries now do this format with the Central Asian countries, to the point where that has almost become its own regional organization in a sense, because you group all the regional countries together and then add one. Do you think that there would ever come a point where the countries in Central Asia decide to abandon that format, the C5+1 format, in order to be able to create a regional organization that they can, address on their own terms, create on their own terms? Or do you think that we're now kind of stuck with this C5+1 format?
C5+1 format works for all at the moment, because this is, again, non-offensive way to communicate with external actors without causing any suspicion on the side of the regional powers. But there were attempts to create Central Asian unions. It's not that we have not tried, it's just a lack of political will on the side of the leaderships of the countries, as well as some unresolved issues, so water management, historical sort of kerfuffle. So it's quite difficult to set those aside. And as you can imagine, I mean, it would be an ideal world where countries can sit together and negotiate some mutually beneficial conditions, but that's a utopian scenario. But nevertheless, there are efforts. But C5, I think, in a way, it's seen, at least by local observers, that you guys are not important per se, but if there are 5 of you, maybe it's worth our attention or our time. And in a way, it's a way to sort of meet all of 5 of us without spending too much time in the region for high-level visits to the region. So I think, again, like we're sort of accepting that, but also noting that C5 plus whoever is a certain format that is highlighting maybe the lack of importance of the countries on their own. So hopefully it will bring something else on our side.
Thank you for that. A question for Fuad and Iskander. Some questions about Russia firing missiles into Ukraine from ships in the Caspian Sea. Do you think that this will affect the 2018 Caspian Sea Treaty or sour security cooperation among the 5 littoral states? With only Russia and Kazakhstan being members of the Csto, what would a future of cooperation in the Caspian Sea look like? Fuad, we'll go to you first, and then we'll go to Iskander.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, this is quite interesting that Russian Navy fires missiles from the Caspian Sea, hitting targets in Ukraine, which it claims that being strictly military targets, but not civilian or any other targets. But first of all, we should mention that those missiles are firing from the Caspian Sea strictly from the Russian maritime borders, within Russian maritime borders, and the agreement of the Caspian Agreement from 2018 means, I mean, that there's overall there's an agreement between those little states that the Caspian Sea is a demilitarized zone, and the foreign navies or foreign countries or military organization cannot be deployed in the Caspian Sea. So we should be in mind that there's within its maritime borders, Russia has its rights, has its own right to fire missiles as it thinks in a proper way, because it claims that there's only that there's a military operation and they hitting military targets or other military facilities of Ukrainian army. But this is not that issue about the Caspian Agreement 2018, because it's strictly about defining the maritime borders between all the little states and giving the proper lines of border with all states, because we know that there's negotiations between states. And one fact to mention that not all countries still ratified this agreement in their respective parliaments. For example, Iran still did not ratify this agreement in 2018, and yeah, therefore, I don't think that will be much affect those agreement, because at least for now, we are now having there's upcoming meeting of littoral states over the Caspian maritime borders, which will be very soon. Maybe there in that meeting there will those state officials will make some new statements that we not come up with yet. But yeah, that will be useful, like to watch those upcoming meeting and then make conclusion that if we are gonna see change on the Caspian Sea status and how it relates to the Ukraine conflict. Thank you very much.
Yes, specifically on the Caspian Sea as a platform for military actions. From Ukraine side, yes, we just recently heard the news that the Ukraine military, they evaluated that the missiles were shot from the Russian territory of Caspian Sea. But I mean, this news were also in March of this year, and still kind of Russian side didn't confirm or not denied it. So it's kind of a big question for, in general sense, certainly for international community, because we have a convention on the Caspian Sea. But I mean, as Fort rightly mentioned, it's if there is a case, such case, which is not confirmed or denied by the Russian side, it's from the territory of the Russian Federation. So in this respect, the Caspian Sea was also kind of militarization of Caspian Sea was also during the high days of the crisis in the Syria, where Russia used it as a platform to strike ISIS fronts in that regard. So what we see is that the militarization and the security activities, this kind of actions, are covering wider range in general sense, and different tactics can be used to reach goals of specific countries. And we're entering into the very turbulent zones of military activity, or hybrid war, as we say, in this regard. And but we need to certainly closely monitor those activities in every part of the region we are living in.
Thank you, Iskander and Fuad. Next question for Ayjan and Raffaello. So as Ayjan pointed out in her remarks, this week, Vladimir Putin made his first foreign visit since the invasion of Ukraine with his visit to Tajikistan. Both Russia and China have military forces in Tajikistan, as well as concerns about the border with Afghanistan. What do each of you think is the potential for Russian and Chinese cooperation or competition in Tajikistan at this time? Ayjan, we'll go to you first.
Right, thanks for your question. To be honest, I don't see why and how China and Russia would fight over Tajikistan or Afghanistan or any other issues. They seem to be not always cooperating, but moving in parallel to each other without stepping on each other's feet, so to say. So I don't see that there would be much contradiction over there. I would see more cooperation probably, or at least like polite silence. Same happened with Ukraine when Russia started the war in Ukraine. China has been officially politely declaring its awareness of the situation and so on and so forth without actually saying anything particular, neither good nor bad. So in a way, I think that would continue. In Tajikistan as well, both China and Russia are sort of okay with Taliban. So I'm not sure how that's gonna be taken by Tajikistan, which is not that okay with Taliban. So that would be very curious to see how Tajikistan would build its conversation around Afghanistan and the new, or the ruling regime, the current ruling regime of Afghanistan, against those two powers who seem to be all right cooperating with this formerly terrorist organization, actually. Yeah, that would be quite interesting to see how it's going to turn out. But I don't see the much competition over there. I think it will be either cooperation or peaceful coexistence.
I mean, I'd agree 100% with Aijan. In some ways, this is the unfortunate element, and it undermines the kind of whole multi-vector narrative in Central Asia, because frankly, China and Russia are never going to fall out with each other over Central Asia. And that's the key thing in some ways. They will always, avoid directly clashing with each other because, and they'll just sort of work in parallel. And I think that's what we see them doing. As I mentioned before, I think they both have different conceptions of how they see their security interests in the region. I think, Russia sees this as its soft underbelly, if you will, and fears about the sort of trouble that comes in through this region, ultimately into Moscow, and sees its response to that has to be this kind of, paternalistic view, it was in help protect these poor little Tajiks from their troubles kind of thing. And I think that's why we see, the base that's continued to be left there, and, some of the security engagement that you see that Russia does in the region. China, on the other hand, is very narrow in its security engagements. It's worried about Uyghur militants specifically. It's worried about trouble coming across this border, maybe coming back to China. If this trouble goes into Tajikistan, I think they think, well, that could be negative, but I don't think they're going to do anything about it. I think they're going to watch and wait and try to engage with whoever comes out on top and try to deal with it. Now, I think, having said all of that, I think what is interesting is Tajikistan, as I would argue, potentially the most unstable of the Central Asian countries. I think that is in some ways the more worrying element. And I think that is the question that I don't think either of the two have really got an answer to. Because if we think about it, we've had Tajikistan, is always been one of the sort of poorer countries. It's got a security apparatus there that, is maybe not as efficient as some of its neighbors. It's having border clashes with Kyrgyzstan on a regular basis in those sorts of disputed borders. It's got its Gorno-Badakhshan region, which is now falling back into what looks an awful lot like some of the problems that they had during their very horrible civil war in the 1990s. We're seeing a sort of repetition of some of those narratives and some of that trouble. And all of this is happening while across the border in Afghanistan, they've got a government that is certainly not doing much about stopping potential militant elements using it as a base to potentially launch attacks into Tajikistan. So there's lots of pointers there. You've also got, an elderly monarch, a president who's about to potentially step aside and hand over the reins of power to a son who's, who hasn't, I think, proved himself in the way that maybe one might hope a future leader of a country has. You've got a lot of quite worrying indicators there. And I think in some ways that's the worrying question about Tajikistan, because I think what you've got is a potentially quite dangerous mix, and which is already having violence and instability produced. And you haven't got regional powers that seem eager to step in to actually try to do something about this. Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine. It's interesting, very interesting that Putin is starting his visit in Dushanbe, but I certainly haven't heard much narratives of the Russian soldiers that are deployed there doing a huge amount. In the early days of Kabul's fall to the Taliban, they did do some training, they did rush some arms sales through, but since then it's been sort of quiet, to be honest, on the sort of Russian side. Now, maybe they're doing stuff discreetly that we're not hearing about, but it's really not very clear that they're trying to help and step in and sort of stabilize the situation. And certainly, as I said, China is not doing that. Again, they're focused on their quite narrow interests, and I think they are going about guaranteeing those. And, but none of them are going to step in and sort of help stabilize the entire situation by the looks of it. And I think that in some ways is the more worrying element and aspect that I point to in Tajikistan. In some ways, I would argue that it could be a very good thing if China and Russia were to decide to actually think about cooperating in some sort of a coherent way in Tajikistan, because it might help sort of bring some stability, frankly, to a place that quite clearly needs it. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aijan and Raffaello, for your remarks. My apologies to all the participants who submitted questions that we didn't get to. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today's session. However, thank you to all of our speakers. You provided fantastic opening remarks as well as excellent analysis and insights. Really appreciate your time today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kangas to close us out.
Thank you so much, Brianne. And thank you again. I'll echo your thanks to our speakers today, also to those questions in the chat box, answered and unanswered. It really shows that the interest in security in the Caspian region is alive and well. And we're also looking, at if you want to say new permutations, but also new interpretations of what that security means. Goodness, we've spent 90 minutes going through this. We could easily spend another few hours. So again, I want to thank you, and Brianne, especially thank you for orchestrating and managing the discussion we've just had. For all in the room, on behalf of the Caspian Policy Center and the Near East South Asia Center, I want to thank you for attending and to encourage you, if you've not already, to register for tomorrow's session, which will be this time, 11 p.m. to 12:30, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, on the future of asymmetric and hybrid threats in the Caspian region. With that, we're done for the day. Again, appreciations to all, and see you tomorrow at the same time. Thank you very much.